Larry, thank you for inviting me. I'm not so sure I'm thanking you for putting me in the suicide slot at the end of the day after so many great talks, but it's been a real pleasure to listen to them up to this point. So I was asked to go up to 30,000 feet again and just consider the translational medicine enterprise. So to begin with, I thought I'd just say what I mean, because when people say translational medicine, they mean all sorts of different things. And I do mean the translation of the promise of basic discoveries, just as we've heard so elegantly, to realize novel therapeutics, diagnostics, and approaches to management. But as Larry started the day, management that actually benefits the public health. So there are many different components to this concept of translation involving people with many disparate skill sets that need to interlock in ways that we very poorly understand. So I'm the guy who stands between you and dinner, and for some of us it's a good Italian meal, and we all love the Italians. Who couldn't? The weather, the clothes, the food, and of course we love them because they're romantics, and we all need to appreciate the romanticism of life. And in fact, if you go to Rome to the Ponte Milvio, the Italian men exemplify their romanticism and their dedication to undying love by putting these locks on the bridge. Now, of course, Italian women don't really buy that with good reason. And in fact, when you say a lock to an Italian, they're not actually thinking about their love of women, but their love of football. Because Italian teams over many, many decades have been noted for their dedication to defense. And the Italian defense has frustrated many more talented teams, so that almost invariably you find an Italian team apparently against all the odds in the World Cup final. And what they call this strategy of defense is catenaccio, which is a lock or a bolt. And the question about translational opportunities is, how can we unlock the catenaccio? Now, why should we care? We've heard some nice examples of why we should care today, but I'd suggest that, again, at a higher level, there are many reasons why we should care, because we have some big challenges facing us that interlock in a way that is more than additive. So here's the first challenge that you're all familiar with in this room, and that is that the number of drugs that are coming to market with a little bit of a bounce here and there has been essentially stable. Not just stable over the years shown in this slide, but as shown quite nicely by Dr. Munoz, stable since the year of my birth, which I think is somewhere over here, actually. And since the year of my birth, while the number of drugs coming to market has remained roughly stable, the estimated cost of bringing those drugs to market has increased in a log linear fashion. So think about it. This is an unsustainable approach to drug discovery and development. There are always going to be the really encouraging examples that are the exceptions to that overall rule, and we've heard a few of them today. But overall, this is an unsustainable business model. And actually, I was at a talk that the IOM held recently, where a guy from PricewaterhouseCoopers said, well, we've looked at this, and we've looked at the performance of the top 12 largest companies in the world and made a projection. The projection is you can invest $1 billion for 12 years, and you can expect to earn around $75 million. Now, even for the most pessimistic Facebook investor, This just doesn't seem like a very good deal. And of course, just a couple of weeks ago, Russia's CTEP inhibitor bombed, and on that day, their stock price declined by approaching 4%. And of course, in the last few days, we've read all about the human genetic evidence about so-called good cholesterol. So various people have plotted this performance in various ways. This is the depiction that is supposed to be the reverse of Moore's law in terms of productivity, the so-called Eroom's law. But no matter what way you look at things, these graphs are not moving in the right direction. Whether you're a yeast biologist or a venture capitalist, you can get the picture. So how has industry responded to that? Well, they've responded to it by merger and acquisition. And what that does is obviously it improves the bottom line in the short term by firing people. And a lot of people have lost their jobs in the pharmaceutical industry in this country. And the pace of merger and acquisition is, if anything, picking up. So even in the first few months of this year, you can see there's been a reasonable amount of activity in this country. And you can pick on any of our large vertically integrated companies. I took Pfizer as an example here. And there's a migration away from their investment in research and development, which has corresponded to a fall in their stock price. And of course, in Pfizer's particular example, they're looking at the disappearance of the most profitable drug that we've had up to now, the $15 billion a year Lipitor franchise. So given the importance of the pharmaceutical industry to the health and wealth of the nation, this is one reason to care. So here's another reason to care, and that is the fraction of our GDP that has been consumed by healthcare. And again, this is something we're all very familiar with. In the yellow, we're looking at the estimated budget deficit as a percentage of GDP, and in the blue, we're looking at one group's estimate of what controlling healthcare costs would do to that, whatever that means. But in a general sense, I only show this to highlight the fact that this has become a sufficiently large issue that politicians, the public, are all invested or at least conscious of the contribution of healthcare costs to our overall fiscal standard. And of course, that's not just a problem for the United States. It's a problem for the developed world. So you can go to other countries that presently are being used as exemplars, like Germany. And you can see apparently sensible people being driven to rather illogical conclusions, driven by their perception of healthcare costs, and particularly the contribution to the enterprise that people like us make. So here's a third problem, and that's a problem at the NIH. So I do appear on this slide because it was in 1980 that I got my first Euro 1, and the Euro 1 is the grant that the NIH gives you that's your first step to independence. So if you look at the Euro 1s, the dark blue curve, or the light blue curve, I should say, in 1980, it wasn't all that surprising that young tyros, well, actually slightly elderly tyros of the age of 30, would get their Euro 1s in that day. But if you look at today, you can see how this demography has shifted. Now, for me, I've ridden the demographic wave. Why should I care? But I should really care, because look how things have shifted. So if you're a simple MD like me, the average age of getting a first Euro 1 today is 46. So we're selecting by that for people who desire to take their first step to independence in middle age. So you can look at this demographic crisis in a variety of different ways. Here we're looking at the percentage of principal investigators aged 36 or younger as a function of time, or those 66 and older as a function of time. As you can see, we've had Il Sorpasso here at the beginning of this century. And then layer onto that the odds of getting a grant. All right? So now, as you probably know, you can submit this grant, you can fail to get it, and you can submit it a second time, and then it's over. So what this number reflects is both of those times together. So at the level of going in for the grant on one occasion, it's much closer to 10% or lower. This is what we call a casino. Okay? All right, we have another problem. One many people in this room are familiar with, and that is the crisis. And obviously the crisis impacted on venture investment into biotech. And the reason I put this up is not to say there's been some recovery in terms of the amount being invested, but rather to draw your attention to the fact that the position in the process where that money is being invested now has shifted on average. So venture is much more likely to say, let's see you get into humans and see proof of principle before we put our money in. So not only has there been a reduction in the amount, but there's been a shift in the timing of that investment, again, on average. And finally, we come to the regulatory body. And we'll say some more about that later, but we're familiar with the crises of oversight, shall we put it that way. We've heard the complaints about the efficiency of approval of efficacy. And then along with New Zealand in this country, we share a perversity that's called direct-to-consumer advertising. And of course, we know that there have been a variety of criminal fines paid by some of our most ethical and largest companies with respect to false claims of benefit. So now that I've really given you a gloom, and more gloom sort of scenario, and you want to head to the bar quickly, let's just consider some ways that we can think about addressing these challenges. I've really only mentioned them to say that we should care about addressing them. So how can we address them? How can we unlock the catenaccio? Does anybody know who this guy is? What can I say? The world's most famous sport. Okay. Well, I think first of all, we should focus on human capital. People make things happen. And I think we have a crisis in a particular type of human capital. So you can argue about where things break down. But there's some suggestion that a place where things disproportionately break down are in phase 2. And we've just heard, I think, a very nice example of the complex challenges that arise when thinking people think about those challenges in phase 2, and how you can perform sophisticated analyses of data that lead you to refine the design of the next studies that you do to try and realize the safe and efficacious potential of the drugs under development. Now, what we have lost are people who have expertise in basic science, who are familiar with projecting their own science across the translational divide into the mechanistic elucidation of drug action in humans. Because the mechanistic elucidation of drug action in humans, as we've heard, can be complicated. And as we heard from Larry earlier this morning, the real trick also, which is supposed to happen in phase 2, is understanding the factors that contribute to the variability of drug response. Now, missing these people has a perverse effect in a variety of ways. In a large drug company, when a drug gets into humans in phase 1, when it's tolerated without something really bad happening, the people from marketing who've actually been sitting at the table before it's got to phase 1 are saying, okay, it's time to move into phase 3. Because there are no people with this expertise in most drug companies, the voices that say, hold it, slow down, let's actually understand what's going here, they don't exist. Furthermore, the consultants who are brought in are the people who run large phase 3 trial clinical engines. And what do they say? Let's get into phase 3. Or if you're in a biotech company, it's venture people playing the same game as marketing. So I think human capital is actually top of the list. Now, the absence of this sort of expertise hits more than the drug discovery and development process. It hits all of us as patients, because there are quite a few studies now that show that the doctor who prescribed you your medicine gets her information from the same place about drugs as you do, direct-to-consumer advertising. So in our universities, we have fallen down in not producing people that have expertise in human pharmacology. Okay, number 2, I think we should focus on infrastructure. Back to the Germans. Very impressive. They've sustained their investment in infrastructure, and we've provided a nice contrast. So, as far as infrastructure in translational medicine and therapeutics are concerned, I'll give you a couple of examples. So 8 years ago, we founded the first Institute of Translational Medicine called ITMAT. And we did 2 things in retrospect that turned out to be important within an academic institution. So the first thing is illustrated in this slide. We said, we know you do translational medicine in all sorts of centers and institutes, departments. We're not here to compete with you. We're here to add value to what you're trying to do. And the second thing we did, which turned out to be really important, although we didn't realize it at the time, was we actually wrote down and said what we were trying to do. We said we're trying to increase the number of people who do their science in the space between proof of concept in cells and model systems and the mechanistic elucidation of drug action at the end of phase 2. We're not trying to increase the number of people that transit that space or drive them to transit that space, because we reckon the more people have that expertise, the more likely they're to interact, or some of them will transit that space over time. And the second objective was really just to identify and reduce the barriers that confronted them. Now that turned out to be important because in something like translational medicine, people can project onto you what they think you're trying to do and criticize you for not achieving it. And I think we've seen a bit of that in the NCAT story. So over that time, we traded in the currencies of academic systems. We had space and we had money. We also had a virtual dimension. It became a campus-wide resource. All the schools at Penn, the Children's Hospital, associated institutes, etc. So now people have voted with their feet, and we've established diverse educational problems, invested in infrastructure, and invested in programs from the top down, where we've catalyzed programs, and these are just a few of them that relate to drug development, and more importantly from the bottom up, by having a variety of calls for interdisciplinary translational research. Now the problem with something like this in an academic center is, how do you measure success? Well, I don't know the answer to that, but I'll show you a few ways that we're approaching that. Well, one is we want to focus interaction between people who previously did not interact. So one thing you can look at is the connectome based on either shared patents, shared papers, shared grants. And all I can say is over that time it's got denser, it's got larger, and we've taken the approach that we've published on to try and identify several control groups. But of course that's where the system breaks down. More importantly, as time goes on, if you're lucky, you can actually have examples that might count. So here are two examples where we played a role that I think was important and perhaps illustrative of what program support from these types of endeavors can actually deliver. So over here is Jean Bennett, who developed with her husband a gene therapy approach to Leber's optic atrophy. Jean actually, first of all, found a dog model of the disease and literally made the blind dog see. With that proof of concept, she was completely unsuccessful in getting any support from the private sector, from getting any endowment from interested individuals, or from attracting support from the NIH. So actually it was through ITMAT and through a similar center in the Children's Hospital that was run by Kathy High that she had the resource that allowed her to proceed. Now, having made the blind see, with Frances Collins showing videos of her patients to a very interested Congress, she has more NIH money, more endowment, and more industry interest than she can cope with. A similar story, but at an earlier stage in the process, is Carl June's remarkable work developing serial killer T lymphocytes. And I'm sure you're familiar with the dramatic proof of principle in a small number of patients that's been published in Science Translational Medicine and the New England Journal of Medicine. Again, pairing two institutes in Penn, ITMAT and the Cancer Center this time, Carl got support to sustain his effort at a time when he was finding it difficult to get the requisite support from the NIH and had very little interest from industry. And of course, again, that's completely transformed now. So I'd say they're real outputs of investment. And then you can look at it in other ways. You can say you've got the attention, you've got a seat at the table of a major institution so that they'll actually put bricks and mortar around the concept. It's a bit like the Costa Concordia, actually. Okay, so as we know, not just at institutional levels now, but also at a national level, the NIH has had this initiative, NCATS, where much of the money is sequestered and committed to existing funding principles, particularly the Clinical and Translational Science Awards. But I think, depending on what happens at the local level, and perhaps what happens at the national level, and it's not just within the United States these initiatives are occurring, the objective is really to allow academia to play in this space. Now, one of the interests, obviously, is this issue of repurposing. And I'm an old prostaglandin guy, so I always like to say that the most important cost-effective drug repurposing that has ever occurred has been the repurposing of aspirin at low doses for cardioprevention. People think of it as a sort of optional extra because, of course, Plavix, which works indistinguishably well, was an $8 to $9 billion a year drug, and aspirin cost 17 cents a tablet. But I'll remind you that aspirin, which actually had 10 years of clinical trials failing to show its cardioprotective effects because they were being done in the wrong people and designed poorly, when they were done appropriately in placebo-controlled trials in people with unstable angina, reduced not just the myocardial infarction rate by half, but the death rate by half. So this is not an impotent drug. But it is a drug that has been the topic of war reparations and buyouts and has moved back and forth across the Atlantic. So I like this one. This is obviously the chemist in Bar who's credited with the delivery, but I like this one here. Every single tablet, every director of the Bar company is an American. The tablets are made on the banks of the Hudson. Anyway, what can I say? Okay, so the third thing I think we come to, which my chair prompted me on, is regulatory reform. I think the regulator has a really important place to play here in rearranging the incentives in a way that lets us move to a new model of drug discovery and development, a more efficient and a less expensive one. So first of all, patients participate in these trials. They give of their bodies, they give of their body fluids, and yet if a drug is not brought to market and the data are brought to the FDA, that's where they stay. Now, the drug may have encountered a safety problem, a failure of efficacy, or it may have been stopped in development for strategic reasons. But not only do the public or interested competitors know nothing about the data or can't access the data, neither can academics who might be interested in trying to repurpose the drug for a completely different reason. So I think we need to either incent or require the industry to collaborate with the FDA to reveal the concealed data. Now, another perverse incentive in the process is that if you're developing a drug, you are incented to confine your clinical development to exploring mechanisms of drug action that you think are just relevant to the target indication that you're pursuing. Because looking at other systems effects of the drug are an opportunity to get bad news. Well, I've news for you. I'd rather get the bad news early or discover the new efficacy early rather than wait for it to emerge years later at the back end of a clinical trial. So I think what the FDA needs to do is really to create a safe haven for the early exploration of the comprehensive spectrum of drug action as soon as drugs go into humans. And we're always hearing how the clinical center at the NIH is underutilized. Well, they're very well equipped to do deep phenotyping of people. And surely there's a resource that could be mobilized nationally to do comprehensive phenotyping of drugs once they have safely got into humans. A lot of talk about staged approval and withdrawal. I am all for it. It's ludicrous that we have this binary approach. I was involved a lot in the Vioxx story. I never called for it to be withdrawn, actually. Here's a drug that had absolute value to people and had a problem in maybe 1 or 2% of people exposed. We should have done the science or incented the science to be done to conserve the value and manage the risk of that drug, and that's just one example. Now, one of the great attractions of staged approval or withdrawal is you can decrease the value of first-in-class. Now, at first glance, that seems crazy. But the whole emphasis in drug development is on speed. We need to slow down. We need to put an emphasis on quality at the expense of speed. Hasten slowly, festina lente. And that's where staged approval can really come in. And I'm not for a moment saying we should discourage innovation. We should reward innovation, just like that approach we heard in the talk before mine. But we should reward people who innovate to address an actual unmet clinical need. We hear loads of stuff about unmet clinical needs from the industry. Drugs are mostly studied in phase 3 to get drugs approved, not to address an unmet clinical need. Sometimes they do. But they can be two completely distinct issues. We know from the AIDS community more than any others, the people best positioned to say what the unmet clinical need is are the patients, right? So let them and their champions articulate the unmet medical needs and let the regulator reward those that actually address those challenges. Okay, so we're coming close to the end, and I've really put you through it. So I'm going to give you some entertainment at the end by talking about something I know absolutely nothing about, other than that it's a big problem too. And I heard an expert talk about it this morning, so I know it's a big problem. I think the unrealistic expectations around intellectual property in the university sector and in the private sector, and the outmoded structures around intellectual property are like a dead man's hand on the tiller in this whole process of drug discovery and development. So we used to have a system where we had large, vertically integrated drug companies that did everything. They identified the target, they made things druggable, they did the modeling, they did the proof of concept, they did all the phases, and they marketed the drug. And from the first part of the talk, you know, these vertically integrated companies are disintegrating. It's only a matter of speed and time. So I think we're going to move to a different, more modular approach to drug discovery and development. And the modules are going to be drawn depending on the challenge from either pharma or biotech or academia, and assembled in different ways depending on the challenge. And in the ideal world, that is the ideal, because this is a very heterogeneous process. And the best people at all stages in the process for all these different therapeutic challenges don't reside in one company, one university, or indeed one country. So what we'd really like to be able to harvest is the ability to assemble the best modules from no matter where they are, to collaborate in a way that they do it in an efficient way, that they hand off their deliverables to the next group in the chain. Sounds a bit wild, doesn't it? Well, it's been done. So we have a proof of principle. It's a tough time for the Greeks at the moment. I'm just expressing a little solidarity here. It's been shown to work in the altruistic sector. So outfits like Medicines for Malaria have shown that the provision of two things, a pot of money and the perception that there's no money to be made, in other words, altruism and the perception of a lack of profit, where one begins and the other ends, doesn't really matter. Those things have enabled them to respond to very dramatic challenges. Make a novel anti-malarial drug that costs less than $1 a day, that you only have to give once because people don't comply, for example. And to harness people from those different sectors from across the globe to bring something to phase 3 for 200 or 300 million, as opposed to 4 billion. So remember, that ballooning cost of the traditional model is mostly the cost of failure of a model we know doesn't work very well. So the question is, can we ever export that into the for-profit sector? Now that's a big question. Okay, well the first thing you'd have to do is create a pot of gold, right? Well, you've probably guessed by now. That's one of our national specialties where I come from. But of course there's a little local resonance in that sort of concept as well. So who would contribute to such a pot of gold? Maybe charities would. They're interested in human health. They've done a magnificent job in creating the pot of gold in the altruistic sector. Companies, not just pharma companies. And again, we know this from the altruistic sector. Companies in sectors that you wouldn't expect have invested in creating this incentive pot. And all they're really interested in, actually, as we heard very elegantly this morning, is actually making money. And whether they make money by pumping oil or by investing in something like this, doesn't matter. Governments. So there's a big pressure now, and actually in the current PLOS Medicine, there's a report on the need to focus not just on neglected diseases, but underserved populations. And the conversation has begun about the development of global treaties to try and address this issue. If I run out. Oddly enough, I kid you not. It's been in the Financial Times recently. At a meeting like this, people were suggesting credit default swaps. And I was delighted to say that while you were looking for your copy of The Economist, I was reading your article on my online copy of The Economist. And we heard very nicely about this tradable shares issue. So there are lots of ways you can create a pot of money. But it's not enough. I was a bit disturbed to find that I got this picture actually from the UC Boulder website for undergraduates, Larry. I think there's a problem to be addressed here. So the issue is a pot of money isn't enough in the for-profit sector to address this issue. So what do I mean by that? I mean that if the best group in the world that you want to engage in this process, in say phase 2, is uninterested in the particular challenge you have vis-a-vis their own research program, how do you get them to involve? You say to them, we'd like you to do this and we'll support you doing the study, and they'll say, well, actually, I'm not interested in doing the study. So somehow or other, there has to be a lure in the for-profit sector that is a distribution of the reward. Now, it didn't really matter in the old days in the large vertically integrated companies because if there was a possibility that the composition of matter actually turned into an approved drug, the chemist who sat on the dominant IP and the secretary who works in Pfizer are all going to do okay because they've all got shares in Pfizer. But that doesn't extrapolate into this multi-sectorial, multi-geographical, modular approach to drug discovery and development. So I think we've got to start getting a little more creative about this aspect of IP. And I would say, actually, even though we saw the systems biological lawsuit depiction of all the people who have intellectual property around the phone in your pocket, the dominant reward, and certainly in the case of Apple, the dominant reward and the dominant IP is the integrated product that you actually buy. Now, is there a message for us here? Well, we've heard a lot about increasing the pre-competitive space. I'm all for that. I mean, one particular area that's completely insane where people compete is in the elucidation of biological networks. Why should that be competitive? Who knows? It can be competitive to select the nodes you target and the chemistry around them, but that's an obvious area for the pre-competitive space. In that same issue of PLOS Medicine, there's a report recommending these open knowledge, innovative frameworks, etc. So there's a lot of that. But here's a suggestion. We've got a lot of mathematical modelers, perhaps in this room. We model drug exposure and response based on hardly any data all the time. And we refine it as we start to get data in a Bayesian sort of fashion. So you could have a therapeutic challenge, like the malaria one I gave you, but one closer to home in terms of, say, cardiovascular disease. And you could say, here is where we forecast the biggest barriers from going from discovering something to having an approved drug. And you could model how you would distribute the reward if the drug became approved prospectively. And you could refine that model as you went along, if you chose to, in a Bayesian fashion, or based on prior attempts to address the issue. So the attraction there is that you would be actually distributing the reward after value had been realized. And you'd be giving a piece of the action to all the people that you're trying to incent to play in the game. And of course there'd be mistakes, but there are mistakes right now. And we heard very nicely this morning how those mistakes are resolved. It's through the court system. But I think this is the really important issue. We get away from this business of focusing everything on composition of matter, where the odds of that matter being what we're interested in is like a very long bet in a casino. People used to patent transistors. They don't anymore. And they stopped a long time ago. Okay. So it's time for me to end. It's probably good for you. It's certainly good for me. And I think the message that I was hoping to convey was that these are really problems that affect all of us. They affect us no matter what sector we sit in. They affect us whether we're just patients, the family of patients, prescribers, whatever. They affect all of us. This is relevant to the health and wealth of the nation. And really, it requires imaginative and collaborative solutions. Thank you.